Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kimball Art Museum. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to a talk by my great friend, Nicole Myers. Nikki, if you'll forgive me for calling her by her nickname, is the Barbara Thomas Lemmon Senior Curator at the Dallas Museum of Art, which she joined in 2016. You will all, I hope, have seen her beautiful exhibition, Morisot Impressionist Woman, which just closed a few weeks ago at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. In conjunction with that, she did a beautiful installation in Dallas from the permanent collection of women artists in Europe. And she has just incorporated the great gift of the Eugene and Margaret McDermott collection into the permanent collection of the Dallas Museum of Art in a wonderful reinstallation that opened a couple of months ago. She is at work for the future on an exhibition of the Cubist still lifes of Juan Gris. She is also at work on an exhibition that will be in Dallas that she began when she was in Kansas City at the Nelson Atkins Museum on the olive orchards of Vincent van Gogh. And she is also at work, it makes me dizzy to read all this, on Picasso and his sources. As I said, she was previously at the Nelson Atkins Museum as curator of European painting and sculpture, and before that she held curatorial positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, at the St. Louis Art Museum, and where I got to know her at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she joined my department when she was just 1 year out of Washington University in St. Louis, her alma mater. She is also a graduate of the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, where she did her PhD on Courbet and his nudes. And I will, at the risk of embarrassing her, but also singing her praises, I will tell you that the great art historian Thomas Crow, who is on the faculty at NYU, told me that Nicole Myers' dissertation was the best dissertation that he had read in a decade. So, yeah. As you know, that only happens once every 10 years. So would you please tonight welcome Nicole Myers.
Wow, I feel like I should just go home after that introduction. But it was nice to have some applause about my dissertation topic because I am going to drown you in it this evening. Well, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming out. And thank you, George, for this wonderful invitation to come and lecture on what is one of my favorite subjects, the nude in 19th century French art. I was delighted to be able to write for the catalog on Renoir's early nudes. And this evening I'll be giving even greater context to Renoir's production by exploring this complex, high-stakes genre within Western art. Before we begin, though, I'm just going to give you a little public service announcement. This talk has been rated R for nudity and is intended for a mature audience, so consider yourself warned. If you stumbled in here by accident, now is your time to leave. But of course, you know, the temperatures are dropping outside, but in here, it's about to get really hot. In 1876, at the Second Impressionist exhibition, Renoir debuted a sensual portrayal of an undressed woman ensconced in a shady, woodsy setting. He titled it simply Etude, or Study, and is arguably one of his most admired paintings. It symbolizes not only Renoir's production, synonymous today with the voluptuous female nude, but also that of Impressionism, as it so beautifully demonstrates the virtuosic brushwork, vibrant palette, and dazzling effects of light and atmosphere that we associate with the movement. While there may be debate about the aesthetic value of Renoir's late nudes, a debate that this exhibition is boldly taking on, there seems to be almost universal appeal for early works like this, which makes it that much more jarring when we read reviews of it from 1876. Several critics found it incredibly disturbing and even macabre. One argued that it would have been better to dress the large nude, as his purplish skin tones reminded him of game meat going bad. Pretty harsh, right? It gets worse. Another critic cried, "Let's throw a veil on Renoir's Venus, which should have just been hidden behind a screen." Writing for Le Figaro, Albert Wolff pronounced, quote, "These so-called artists call themselves intransigents, impressionists. They take canvas, color, and brush, randomly throw down some tones, and sign the whole lot. Try then to explain to Monsieur Renoir that a woman's torso is not a heap of decomposing skin with patches of purplish greens that denote a state of the total decay of a cadaver." It's quite a leap from rotting corpse to today's perception of this nude as a beautiful icon of Impressionism, available on products from wall calendars to cigarette cases, which you can order now, just in time for the holidays. But Renoir was certainly not surprised by his contemporary's strong, albeit exaggerated reactions to his painting. The fact that he called it simply study, rather than titling it as he would of a finished picture, was a preemptive strategy. He knew it would be judged harshly on account of its sketch-like appearance, particularly as it concerned the time-honored genre of the nude, so he sought leniency by presenting it as a preparatory work, a category that was granted a certain level of roughness and execution. If we unpack the criticism, the dominant thread in Renoir's treatment of the body, most notably his recreation, was most noticeably the recreation of the effect of dappled sunlight dancing across exposed flesh. We take for granted the Impressionists' innovative depiction of shadows using greens and blues, rather than the grays and blacks taught by the government-sanctioned School of Fine Arts. We also take for granted their fluid brushwork and shifting focus that opposed the firm drawing and precisely defined contours espoused by the Academy, the governing body of France's art system. Renoir's bravado treatment of the body, so loose, colorful, and fluid, deliberately challenged the official style that demanded evenly lit, smooth, and pearly-toned skin for its classically inspired nudes. It was this comparison that prompted the sarcastic reference to Renoir's woman as Venus. Although it wasn't commented upon, there's a detail that likely also provoked their ire, one that to our eyes is rather subtle at first glance, but in the 19th century would have been immediately noticed: the woman's jewelry, a gold bracelet, coral earring, and sparkling ring, which announces that this is not the timeless, idealized, symbolic nude of high art. This is no mythological goddess of love, toga draped across her lap, but an ordinary French woman who's taken off her clothes for some God-unknown reason and is just hanging out there half naked in the woods. To use Kenneth Clark's famous formulation, she's naked, she's not nude. The naked is the here and now, the real, the individual, the model who has stripped for the painter and is posing in her underwear. This simple transformation from nude to naked was seen as both offensive and revolutionary, for the nude held a particularly exalted place within the Academy. From the moment of its creation in the 17th century, the Academy ranked the importance of paintings by the subject they portrayed. History paintings, which depict subjects taken from classical history, mythology, or the Bible, were placed at the very top of this hierarchy. This is because these subjects required mastery of human anatomy, in addition to an artist's intellectual capacity to improve upon nature by idealizing their subject. Within this structure, the perfected monumental nude was considered the highest form of artistic achievement, the sublime vehicle for expressing humanity's most noble ideals. As such, the nude was a political battleground where major claims were staked regardless of style or school. And the front line was the Salon, the regular exhibition held by the Academy that served to promote its conservative artistic agenda. A jury composed of artists, typically academicians, judged artist submissions and decided what work would go on display. Until the establishment of independent exhibition venues in the second half of the 19th century, the Salon was the place for artists to show their work to the public, to receive critical attention and attract commissions or clients. Exhibiting at the Salon was of central importance to anyone seeking to establish themselves as a professional, but exhibiting a large-scale nude was fundamental to establishing a reputation as a great artist. It was a benchmark of success, and not just for academic artists, but also those with avant-garde leanings, such as Renoir. Though today he's practically synonymous with the nude, it wasn't actually a dominant motif in his career until 1885, when he was 44 years old, and it was just a year before the last Impressionist show would be held. Prior to that, Renoir's nudes were rare in comparison to the genre scenes and portraits that make up the bulk of his early production. And yet, he understood that in order to make a name for himself and demonstrate his full range of abilities, he needed to exhibit a nude. From 1863 to 1870, the nude dominated his submissions to the Salon, and it's a story of constant trial and failure, of trying to find a unique artistic voice while towing the line between acceptable and non-acceptable forms of nudity, both to please and appease the Salon censors. As we'll see a little later on, Renoir vacillated between two models for the nude, one based on academic precedents represented by the neoclassical school, and the other based on a new realist mode that subverted that very tradition. Renoir was by all accounts at a great crossroads in the depiction of the genre, and by the time he succeeded in getting a nude into the Salon of 1870, and I'm showing you that painting here, the field in which he was playing had radically changed. Before we move forward with Renoir's story, we need to move back in time to the turn of the 19th century, when an incredible shift took place in the depiction of the nude that shaped both his production and also how we think about and discuss the nude genre today. If I ask you to picture in your mind a painting of a nude, I've given you a blank screen here so that you can really picture in your mind any nude that you want. You got it in your head? Okay, how many of you pictured a male nude? So my guess was correct, not very many of you. When we talk about the nude genre today, it goes without saying, we're talking about the female nude, an undressed woman. But you might be surprised to learn that this understanding or assumption is a relatively recent phenomenon. For centuries, it was the idealized male nude that reigned supreme within the tradition of Western art. It wasn't until the second quarter of the 19th century, the period in which Renoir was born, that the female nude became a subject considered worthy of high art in its own right, and it eventually supplanted the male nude as the norm. The transition from male to female was so thorough, and our cultural indoctrination so complete, that today when we discuss the genre of the nude, it's understood to be female. If you want your audience to understand the subject as a man, you have to qualify it as a male nude, much in the same way that if you want your audience to understand an artist as female, you have to say that it's a woman artist. Born in classical antiquity, the male nude was revived in the Renaissance, from which point it remained a constant presence in painting, sculpture, and works on paper until the beginning of the 19th century. It was the idealized male nude that was seen in the academic tradition as the ultimate embodiment of physical, intellectual, and moral achievement, in essence, the best that art and humanity had to offer. The representation of the heroic male nude reached its height in France at the end of the 18th century, with neoclassical paintings like those by its leader, Jacques-Louis David. His monumental Intervention of the Sabine Women is a textbook demonstration of both history painting and neoclassical principles. The subject is taken from ancient Rome, and the male bodies are treated in an idealized and sober style that together represent the highest of masculine virtues: physical and moral strength, rationality and order, democratic patriotism. Not accidentally, these values coincided with those of the French Revolution, and David's neoclassicism became synonymous with the revolutionary cause, at times even used as propaganda. He began planning this painting, a scene about reconciliation, while imprisoned during the Reign of Terror. But with the end of the Revolution and the overthrow of Napoleon's despotic empire in 1815, neoclassicism, the official style of both of these failed political initiatives, began to fall out of favor. This was helped along by the emergence of new aesthetic movements in the 1830s and 1840s, such as Romanticism and Naturalism, that developed in opposition to neoclassical values. By emphasizing contemporary subjects, these competing schools found fewer occasions to paint the nude. Well, the male nude, that is. While it remained central to a classical fine arts education, it began to disappear in practice. A virtual retreat was made from employing the male nude to embody lofty, rational, partisan ideas in the wake of so much violence and political unrest, creating space for the reassuringly passive and definitively sexy female nude to take center stage. It was Jean-Auguste Dominique Eng, one of David's most promising students, who unwittingly helped put the nail in the coffin of the neoclassical male nude. His Grand Odalisque, which was exhibited at the Salon of 1819, marked the first time a solitary, contemporary, monumental female nude was offered for public display with absolutely no narrative, purpose, or artistic precedent. There's nothing moralizing or uplifting about this nude. Rather, we're shown a decidedly naked woman lounging in a modern-day harem, cunningly suggested by only a few key props. The purpose of this body is to be viewed and enjoyed solely on the merits of its physical beauty. To be sure, there was always a market and an audience for paintings depicted saucy subjects with naked ladies. This was nothing new. But when it came to edifying the morals of the French public, the salon's purported goal, the genre was tightly regulated, as the female nude presented a particular set of challenges. The male nude was a desexualized emblem that exuded meaning above and beyond its physical characteristics. Although we might admire it for its perfected physical form, it wasn't meant to be a passive object of desire, but rather an active vehicle for the expression of intellectual, spiritual, even religious ideals. The stakes in this gendered presentation of the nude body were quite high when one considers that the primary makers, audience, and consumers of the nude at this time were explicitly, if not almost exclusively, men. While the male nude served as a channel for the moralizing content of history paintings, the female nude was always an object of sexual desire, even when invested with symbolic meaning, such as a portrayal of the mythological Graces or the biblical Susanna being spied upon by elders. As the only academic subjects that justified the presence of the nude were depictions of literary or historical characters or timeless figures stemming from classical imagery, the story of the female nude in France is one of towing the line between high art and popular erotica. So how did Ingres get his sexy modern concubine past the conservative salon jury? As it turns out, the odalisque, who was by definition a sex slave or concubine, was something of a loophole, for it was virtually the only subject drawn from contemporary life that the Academy deemed acceptable until the middle of the 19th century. Though today it's hard to consider Orientalist nudes as anything other than the product of male fantasy and artistic license. In the 19th century, they were perceived as representing a slice of contemporary life in North Africa and the Middle East. What made the odalisque acceptable was the distancing of the subject in geographical space. Sure, it's a naked lady, but hey, she's not French. She's safely situated in some faraway place that none of us are ever going to go. And more importantly, she's young, she's svelte, she has skin like porcelain, her facial features are generic, and she's stripped of all body hair. Ingres followed academic expectations for the idealized portrayal of the body, and, in doing so, gave his undressed woman the cloak of acceptability, transforming the imperfect, the human, the naked, into the noble nude of high art. By stripping away the serious narrative that justified the depiction of the female nude, Ingres produced an entirely new genre, the nude for nude's sake, which would have tremendous and ultimately ruinous ramifications for the French Academy. And this new genre came with novel iconography. By posing the odalisque, an odaliscan slave with her arms crossed above her head, Ingres adapted the traditional gesture of sleep established by Venetian painters like Giorgione in the early 16th century. But rather than suggesting sleep, as was tradition, he invoked the classical pose to represent voluptuousness and erotic languor. Take a good look at this pose. You're going to see it again and again, laying down and standing up. It becomes both the battle cry and the last gasp of the classical nude genre in the 19th century. Ingres' erotic nudes, a number of which went on view in Paris in a private exhibition in 1846, essentially opened a floodgate for artists to paint brazenly sexual representations of the female body from that point forward. For in the context of the strict moral dictates of France's fine arts administration, eroticism could be present if it conformed to a specific visual code that hinged on the perceived morality of the so-called desexualized subject. So long as the female body was not anatomically correct, so long as it was depilated, polished, and presented as an odalisque, or some kind of vaguely historicizing figure, dressed as it were in the trappings of high art, it was tolerated by the official censor and public alike. The result of this policy was the growing inclusion of erotic nudes masquerading as generic Romans, generic Greek women, bacchantes, bathers, and nymphs within the government-sponsored salon over the course of the 19th century. A narrow margin separated the decorous from the scandalous, and the game was in how far artists could push the limit and still slip their sexy nudes past salon juries. While one strategy was to distance the sexualized female body in space, a new category of provocative nude was introduced in the Salon of 1847, the nude that was safely distanced in time. That year, Thomas Couture unveiled his monumental Romans in their Decadence, a dramatic recreation of an orgy intended to symbolize the decline of the Roman Empire. His classical treatment of the nude and its depiction within the context of antique life justified the painting's massive scale and explicit sexual content in the salon jury's eyes, despite the fact that the story was completely fabricated. Okay, and bonus points here, if you can spot Ingres' iconography, if you will, a standard figure in his languid pose, transposed from the harem to ancient Rome. Did you find her? There she is. Jean-Léon Gérôme made his debut at the Salon of 1847 with The Cockfight, a suggestive painting that depicts primarily nude, almost life-size adolescents fighting roosters on an antique patio. Gérôme ingeniously contrived the pose of the young girl to conceal that which is normally exposed, her breasts, while revealing that which is typically hidden, her sex, just left of the composition's center. As with Couture's painting, Gérôme's salacious display of the female body was excused by his idealized treatment, as well as a historicizing theme, which introduced yet a new category of the nude that was dubbed antique genre painting. Surprisingly, neither Couture's nor Gérôme's nudes were singled out by critics for impropriety. That honor would go to Auguste Clésanger for his Woman Bitten by a Snake, which was the success by scandal of 1847. The sculpture's incendiary reception was based on several factors, not least of which was the completely nude, life-size woman who was a recognizable public figure. I mean, if you're gonna go big. The model was Apollonie Sabatier, a well-known actress and courtesan who was famous for her voluptuous curves. Placed strategically on its side, the nude's twisting pose conveniently exposes both the front and the back of the body, allowing unfettered views of prominent breasts, buttocks, and genitalia, a view enhanced by Clésanger's adaptation, of course, of Ingres' cheeky pose. Despite being stripped of specific facial features and pubic hair, and thereby transformed into a classical nude, the sculpture's realism was so great that Clésanger was accused of having transferred a plaster cast of Sabatier's body into marble. Adding insult to injury, the narrative context of Clésanger's realistic woman was hardly cut and dry. Recognizing the potential for the nude's unabashed sensuousness to disturb public morality, Clésanger supposedly added a bronze serpent encircling the figure's left leg at the last minute in order to appease the salon jury with a kind of generic allusion to a biblical or a classical subject. If you're looking for it, the bronze is now gone. It was replaced with a marble snake that's wrapped around the figure's wrist. Nevertheless, several critics of the time made clear that the addition of the serpent in no way disguised what to them was the work's true subject, a naked woman writhing not in pain, but in orgasmic pleasure. Théophile Gautier noted the work's modernity, declaring it, quote, a masterpiece which is neither a goddess nor a nymph, not a forest nymph, not a mountain nymph, not a sea nymph, but simply a woman. The hypocrisy inherent within the Academy's distinction of what was an appropriate nude and what was not was perhaps best represented at the Salon of 1850, when Théodore Chassériau presented his bather sleeping near a stream. Following Clésanger's lead, Chassériau depicted Alice Ozzy, his mistress, who was also a recognizable actress and high-class courtesan, reclining in the foreground of a sylvan setting. Chassériau was Ingres' sole pupil to follow him in the genre of the monumental nude, and the latter's influence is particularly evident in the pose of the model. I don't even have to point this out for you anymore, do I? But he takes it a step further, transferring his Sleeping Beauty back to the great outdoors in an even more direct reference to Giorgione's idyllic Sleeping Venus, likely an attempt to align his outrageously sensual presentation of the female body with the classical genre of the pastoral nude. For as the title makes clear, the subject of this pastoral is not a nymph or a goddess, but an ordinary woman taking a nap after a bath and using her own discarded dress and undergarments as bedding. To drive this point home, Chassériau not only included Ozzy's facial features, but he also included her underarm hair, a decisively taboo allusion to a real female body. In spite of this audacious detail, Chassériau's bather didn't cause a scandal, perhaps because his depiction was still more or less idealized. A bright, even light smooths away the skin's imperfections, and this was a trick, of course, that he learned from his teacher, Eng, and the supple, youthful body conforms to classical proportions of beauty. He seemed to have struck a perfect balance between tradition and modernity, and his bather was not only accepted by the salon jury and praised in the press, but it was also bought by the French state for the Musée Calvet in Avignon. Chasserio's baffling success undoubtedly provoked what would be the next scandal concerning the depiction of the nude at the Salon in 1853, Gustave Courbet's inscrutable bathers. Monumental in scale, the bathers features two contemporary French women in a dense woodsy glade. One is a corpulent nude stepping out of a shallow pool and walking towards her clothes, which had been draped over the branch of a tree. And the other is undressing on the ground beside her, frozen halfway between removing her stockings. By 1853, Courbet had already made waves at the Salon by exhibiting scenes of contemporary French life, such as rural road menders, on the monumental scale typically reserved for history painting. He was immediately hailed the leader of a new school of painting called Realism, an allusion to his so-called low subjects that were drawn from everyday life. From his early days in Paris as a student, Courbet recognized that in order to make a name for himself, he needed to exhibit a nude at the Salon. But a unique challenge arose for the would-be realist artist. There were relatively few activities in everyday life that necessitated nudity, and even fewer that were not considered morally offensive. Like Clézanger's and Chasserio's examples, Courbet's monumental nude derived from classical imagery of outdoor bathers, such as Venus, Susanna, or Diana, that were transformed during the 18th century into the anonymous, contemporary, and frequently erotic. The trend was started by Watteau with this intimate cabinet picture, Lady at her toilette. Despite including emblematic references to Venus, such as the gilded Cupid and half-shell headboard, Watteau changed the mythological narrative of the goddess of love at her toilette into a contemporary genre scene of an ordinary mistress preparing for a romantic tryst with the help of her maid. Watteau's model was quickly applied to bathing scenes, and the artists spanning the Rococo period, from François Lemoine, whom you're seeing there on the left, to Fragonard, frequently portrayed outdoor bathers without historical pretext, delighting in the depiction of exposed female bodies stepping into pools of water, and often assisted by maids wearing clothing. Even representations of goddesses such as Diana and Venus walked a fine line between history and genre painting, as artists like Boucher deliberately downplayed the mythological content in their paintings. In works like Diana at the Bath, only a few discrete details, such as Diana's diadem and discarded bow and arrows, reveal her identity as a deity. Boucher's Diana was acquired by the Louvre in 1852, and it was immediately copied by a number of young avant-garde artists, such as Edouard Manet, Henri Fantin-Latour, and James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Notably, Courbet began painting his large bathers that same year in 1852. As he'd anticipated, when it went on view in the Salon in 1853, it was immediately attacked by critics for its subversion of the age-old bathing tradition with its aggressively realistic nude. Instead of finding an idealized young nymph, salon goers were faced with what they perceived as a fat, middle-aged, and recognizably bourgeois woman that was consistently characterized as ugly and filthy. Courbet's treatment of the nude provoked ire among critics, and a great deal of ink was spilled on what they found objectionable. I'm going to read you one of the best ones, as it gives a sense of the strong emotions that this painting has provoked in people. Paul de Saint-Victor wrote, quote, "The bathers are to the Dianas, Ledas, and Bathshebas of the great painters, that which toads are to swans, and fish to nereids. Imagine the horrible woman seen from the back, getting out of a pond and showing in its entirety the armored rump of a hippopotamus, fat and engorged. Blackish crevices, identical to those that elephants get on their coarse skin by crushing flies between two wrinkles, go back and forth across this mass of swollen skin, which is, it goes on, which is supported by two misshapen legs built like balusters that are being crushed by obesity and puffiness. A scrap of dish towel serves as a loincloth to this hideous nudity. She moves towards the tree from which she has suspended her old clothes, and her rounded arm attempts to make, during this journey, a gesture from an antique statue of the most crude presumptuousness," end quote. Yowzas. So for any of you who have ever had anything negative written about a work of art you've made or something you might have published, it will probably never be as bad as that. So of course, one of the things they were objecting to were these really strange gestures. The women exchange an incomprehensible dialogue through exaggerated rhetorical gestures that parody the clear narrative structures mandated by the Academy in the genre of history painting. The poses were in fact borrowed from religious paintings depicting Christ telling Mary Magdalene, "Touch me not," after his resurrection. But critics don't seem to have recognized this exact source. Rather, they responded to the meaninglessness and the absurdity of this decontextualized gesture. Of course, as you can imagine, most of them objected to the manner that the body was painted. Courbet didn't stop at painting a plump, mature female body, which already went against academic ideals, but he reveled in exaggerating in its rolls, ripples, and fleshly abundance. His illusionistic shading of the figure's volume using gray and black was read as dirty skin. Cham's caricature published in Le Charivari that you're seeing there in the center features a filthy central bather and is accompanied by the caption, "A 45-year-old woman about to bathe herself for the first time in her life in the hope of finding some relief for her varicose veins." Quiambois' caricature, which you're seeing there on the far right, sarcastically calls her the Venus of the Lower Rhine. If classical nudes represented one extreme, Courbet's realist nude represented its equally contrived other, is the anti-Venus. There's also an unspoken aspect in the painting's iconography that contributed to the critics' strong reaction. For in addition to drawing from high art sources like Boucher, Courbet also found inspiration in low forms of popular culture, and more specifically, the erotic print tradition that grew out of the 18th century iconography of the anonymous nude bather. I'm showing you here how Boucher's sexy nymphs and goddesses were essentially that in name only, and how this imagery was updated in the 19th century through contemporary facial features and hairstyles. And actually, you're going to notice is that the large grouping of nude women get replaced by pairs. Lithographers like Charles Bargue and Joseph Félon seized on this imagery, producing hundreds upon hundreds of prints in the 1850s that feature pairs of contemporary French women lounging, bathing, and generally lolling about woodsy riverbanks, often selling them in albums with titles like The Sylphs, The Nymphs, and Mysteries of the Woods to get them past publishing censors. Okay, and if you do not recognize what the print on the left is riffing, then there's just no hope. The inherently erotic qualities of these prints are underscored by the frequent pairing of blondes with brunettes, the established iconography for lesbian coupling and 18th century libertine imagery, and actually there's a great example of that in the Boucher that's hanging in the exhibition here, as is the appearance of white stockings, which was a stock symbol of lust and sexual availability in Western art since the 17th century. Here you're seeing poor Diana, who is so innocently drying her foot, but still in a pretty racy position, cross legs, lets you get a glimpse between her legs, made extra piquant in the 19th century with the addition of the stocking that's being removed from the bather's foot. A whole subset of these popular prints show women stepping out of a shallow pool, and the bather shown from the back typically displays a curvy backside, a preference that appears to be a continuation of Boucher's 18th century ideal. In an absolutely brilliant mashup, Courbet incorporates all of these visual codes for sexuality, from the stockings to the blonde-brunette pairing to the libertine subject itself, yet he refuses to play up the bather's erotic and sensual qualities. In doing so, he ultimately denies the viewer the pleasure associated with scrutinizing the naked female body, here offered up for consumption on a truly massive scale. Courbet created a parody not only of the new genre, but of the academic tradition itself. By seamlessly melding multiple visual sources from both high and low art forms, he invented a new genre for the depiction of the nude, one in which, to use the critic Louis Hinault's words, the female figure is more than nude, she's undressed. With this controversial, middle-aged, middle-class realist nude, Courbet tore down a 500-year-old artistic system, exposing its hypocrisy and instantly becoming the standard against which successive generations of avant-garde artists would measure themselves. Although Manet is often credited as the inventor of the modern nude as we know it today, it was in response to Courbet that a decade later, he painted his notorious Luncheon on the Grass. In this massive painting, Manet upped the ante by pairing two women, one completely naked and the other bathing in a chemise, with two fully dressed men on the banks of a woodland stream, their rowboat moored on standby. Following Courbet's model, Manet drew upon his extensive knowledge of historic Western art. He combined iconographic sources from the Renaissance to the Rococo to produce an utterly contemporary painting of Parisians enjoying a rather bohemian picnic on the banks of the Seine. The subject, for example, was inspired by Titian's Concert Champêtre, a mysterious allegorical painting that's been interpreted as an image of Arcadia, or man's harmony with nature. The poses and general disposition of the central trio were taken from an engraving after Raphael's now-lost painting, The Judgment of Paris, which was widely circulated in artist studios in the 19th century. The woman bathing in a shift in the background comes from such erotic Rococo bathing scenes as those produced by Jean-Baptiste Pater, whose numerous repetitions of the motif feature large groups of women bathing in transparent white slips, often in the company of men. That Manet was intentionally referencing this type of French Rococo imagery is hinted in the title that he originally gave the painting. He called it Le Bain, or the bath, the title used frequently by Pater and other 18th century artists, both in paint and also in print, when depicting this secular subject. But it's the unconventional nude in the foreground that steals the show, as it rejects the convention of the sexually desirable and flirtatious woman. Unlike Courbet's monumental bather, who, as noted by one of his critics, literally moons the viewer, Manet's nude stares at us intensely with an expression that is part acknowledgement, part bemusement. Her direct gaze denies easy access to the scrutiny and enjoyment of her body, as does Manet's treatment of her flesh, which is flat and void of detail and redirects your attention back to the figure's commanding face. Manet's denial of the hetero-male viewer's pleasure by presenting a nude that was neither allegorical nor sexually appealing in conventional terms can be seen as the heir to the realist tradition begun by Courbet. But if Courbet had subverted the classical genre by creating the first deliberately undesirable nude in his bathers, Manet took it to the next level by presenting an undesirable naked prostitute. For the woman in the foreground sitting on top of her discarded clothing was clearly not a bather in the traditional sense. The only extant motifs at the time that justified the presentation of clothed men with naked women were representations of either artist models or prostitutes, categories that were problematically blurred in the 19th century since women in both professions were paid to remove their clothing. The subject truly baffled Manet's contemporaries. However, the general consensus was that it was vulgar. Critics saw it as an indecent scene of bourgeois men on a scabrous outing with low-class prostitutes. As summed up by the critic Etienne, quote, "A common low-class prostitute from the Rue Preda, stark naked at that, lounges brazenly between two warders properly draped and wearing cravats. These two seem like students on holiday, misbehaving to prove themselves as men, and I seek in vain for the meaning of this uncouth riddle." Manet submitted his audacious history painting to the Salon of 1863, where it was promptly rejected on account of its salacious subject. However, Manet was presented with the opportunity to participate in the now infamous Salon des Refusés, a separate exhibition created by the Emperor, Napoleon III, in response to the particularly harsh Salon jury, which that year had rejected a staggering number of artists, including the young Renoir, which takes us to the last chapter of our talk. If the shared goal of Courbet and Manet was to dismantle the academic tradition by exposing the hypocritical criteria for the acceptable presentation of the female nude, it could not have been starker than at the Salon of 1863. At the same moment that Manet was exhibiting his rejected Luncheon on the Grass at the Salon des Refusés, a slew of academic painters were exhibiting their nudes at the official salon next door. The sudden popularity of Rococo representations of voluptuous goddesses and seductive courtesans sparked a new interest in the genre of the female nude, which in fact was not a standard or even a frequent motif of major salon art until that very year, 1863. The sheer number of nudes on display in that salon prompted the critic Théophile Gautier to dub it the Salon of the Venuses. And indeed, the two great success stories that year were Alexandra Cabanel's Birth of Venus and Etienne Baudry's The Pearl and the Wave Persian Fable. Both paintings present highly erotic and flirtatious nudes that were, in theory, neutralized through their idealized forms, as well as their classical and supposedly literary motifs. But Baudry would admit in a letter to a friend that there was in fact no literary source for his subject. This was no Persian fable. And while his nude was accepted, Manet's was rejected for indecency. This double standard, which allowed the French public to freely engage in sexual fantasy while staunchly maintaining a righteous moral stance, was called out by left-wing writers in Courbet's and Manet's circle. The philosopher Proudhon accused the imperial administration of contributing to the degradation of public morality, pointing out the transparent formula by which the modern taste for voluptuousness could be satisfied. Émile Zola, for his part, wryly commented on Cabanel's Birth of Venus, observing, quote, "The goddess, drowned in a sea of milk, resembles a delicious courtesan, but not of flesh and blood, no, that would be indecent, but made of a sort of pink and white marzipan." In spite of the left's criticism of what they saw as the product of a corrupt system, Cabanel's painting was praised among mainstream art critics and immediately bought by Napoleon III for his personal collection for the extraordinary price of 40,000 francs. His purchase was followed by that of his wife, the Empress Eugénie, of Baudry's painting for 20,000 francs. Such was the official taste of the imperial court, and under its influence, the once highbrow genre of the academic nude was emptied of meaning to please a Philistine audience, a crisis from which it would never recover. Théophile Thoré perhaps summed it up best when describing the preponderance of what he called the Parisian Venuses, young ladies of the sea undressed by Mr. Cabanel and Mr. Baudry. He would lament, quote, "The French school, as it appeared at the Salon of 1863, means nothing. What the painters in vogue are making and why they make them, even they know nothing about it, if it's not perhaps that such a subject will please a certain crowd and will sell for a high price. It seems that they paint for a presumed buyer, and not at all because of a personal aspiration and artistic reason. The big success of the Salon will be for these goddesses that unfortunately don't symbolize beauty as they did in the art of antiquity or Italian art." It was in this contentious context that Renoir, at the age of 22, submitted his first painting to the Salon in 1863. Like Courbet and Manet before him, Renoir understood the importance of exhibiting a large-scale nude at the annual Salon to launch his career. He was well versed in the Academy's hierarchical system, as in 1861 he enrolled in Charles Glaire's studio to pursue traditional academic training following his work as a painter of ceramics, fans, and blinds. Glaire's training was geared towards preparing students for admission both to the Salon and to the School of Fine Arts, which Renoir achieved in 1862. It was through his friendship with Alfred Sisley, Claude Monet, and Frédéric Bazille, each of whom had enrolled in Glaire's studio between 1860 and 1863, that Renoir began to explore his nascent avant-garde inclinations. By the end of 1863, this Glare group had formed a tight-knit circle that shared a strong admiration for Courbet, the father of Realism, and his disciple Edouard Manet. Both of these artists had met this young group by 1865, and both Manet and Courbet served as mentors and friends to varying degrees. Through the examples of Courbet and Manet, the Glare group radically transformed the realist aesthetic. They maintained the emphasis on subjects drawn from everyday life, often on a massive scale, but added innovative plein air painting techniques and shifted their palettes from the dark earth tones of the old masters to bright, luminous color. Nowhere is the influence of the realist masters more evident in Renoir's work than in the handful of nudes he produced in the 1860s. It was likely the influence of both his official and unofficial training that inspired him to paint his first Salon submission, a mythological scene of a nymph and a faun that presumably featured a female nude. Unknown today, the painting was rejected and Renoir promptly destroyed it, perhaps inspired by what he saw when he visited that salon in 1863. As we've seen, he would have found himself at this incredible crossroads between two very different traditions for painting the female nude. Unwilling to choose, his production between 1863 and 1876 can be seen as oscillating between these two distinct poles in an attempt to find a balance between the timelessness and stability of classical art and the down-to-earth ephemerality of realism. Renoir would return to the production of a nude destined for the Salon of 1866 with a painting that's known today only through its inclusion on the back wall of Bazile's studio on the Rue de la Condamine. This one here. It was his first attempt at a large-scale painting, and it depicted two women in a landscape, one nude, seen from the back, making a cryptic gesture with outstretched arms, the other dressed and seated on the ground. We've seen this before, right? Clear imitation of Courbet. In spite of this, or rather perhaps because of this open pastiche, his attempt at exhibiting the monumental painting at the Salon of 1866 was dashed when it was rejected by the jury. For the next year's Salon, Renoir changed a strategy, choosing a familiar mythological subject, Diana the Huntress, in a bid to please the conservative academic jury. Nevertheless, while the subject was traditional, Renoir's treatment of the theme was totally subversive. He presented the goddess as an earthy, physically mature, flesh and blood woman seated next to a freshly slain deer, the realism of both figures boldly referencing Courbet once again. As if to emphasize the contrast in his treatment of the nude with the idealized deities that graced the walls of the salon, Renoir painted large portions of the composition with a palette knife, a technique directly associated with Courbet that ran counter to the smooth and highly finished surfaces promoted by the Academy. Renoir's endeavor to make a serious painting by combining classical subject matter with avant-garde practice was a bold move in his struggle to gain entry to the Salon. In spite of this effort, the jury rejected Renoir's Diana in 1867. The rejection was particularly bitter that year, as Paris was once again hosting the World's Fair, and it was truly a lost opportunity to exhibit and attract a global clientele. But if there was one silver lining, it was that both Courbet and Manet mounted retrospectives of their work in rented pavilions across from the fairgrounds. Courbet displayed 115 works organized by genre, and it must have been revelatory for Renoir to see so many of his notorious salon paintings for the first time. Included among the realist manifestos on display were The Bathers and its pendant, The Wrestlers. Didn't show you that before. This one features two standing, partially nude men jostling in a landscape. It really didn't bring hardly any criticism, if you can believe that. Everybody was focused on the ladies. The retrospective also featured young ladies on the banks of the Seine, what was basically the scandal of the Salon of 1857, and lesser-known, intimately scaled works such as Bather Sleeping Near a Brook that you can see here in the exhibition, which depicts a naked, unidealized contemporary woman dozing in a shady glade. Manet's retrospective featured 56 works spanning his career, among them the only 3 nudes he ever produced in oil on canvas. It's funny, he's credited for being the father of the modern nude, but he really didn't paint it very much. So The Luncheon on the Grass, which you know, Olympia, painted the same year in 1863, and basically taking that depiction of the prostitute indoors, another riff on the Renaissance portrayal of Venus, and Surprised Nymph, an early mythological subject whose pose was also drawn from Old Master sources. The impact of seeing so many paintings by the two leaders of realism had a profound effect on Renoir. Inspired by Courbet's Wrestlers, he created one of his most original, boldly unconventional paintings, not only within his own production, but within the 19th century, since, as you'll recall, male nudes had long fallen out of favor. In Boy with a Cat of 1868, a nude boy is shown from the back standing in a shallow interior space. He leans against a piece of furniture draped with silky white fabric embellished with flowers, a pattern echoed on the floral carpet below, and he embraces a large calico cat seated on a velvety green pillow. Drawn from a classical prototype, the pose was likely based on the sleeping hermaphrodite, a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture in the Louvre that features a nude of dual sex laying face down on a bed, its arms cradling its head on a pillow. Renoir, a frequent visitor to the Louvre, brought the figure to its feet and inverted its orientation in an incredible subversion of the traditional iconography of the female nude. Everything, from the domestic setting, pale skin, youthful body, emphasis on the buttocks, and indirect gaze, to the floral fabric and also the cat, a conventional stand-in for female genitalia, is standard code for the display of the female nude in Western art, here called into question by the gender of the subject, as in its classical prototype. In another incredibly bold move, Renoir transported a male figure into the domain of the feminine. He retained all the signifiers for the erotic display of the female body, recast with a sensual male nude whose opaque, chalky pallor and relatively flat modeling recalls that of Manet's Olympia, as does the awkward cross-legged pose and dark, shallow interior decorated with floral wallpaper and rich green and white textiles. It's truly a stunning work, but one that remained an outlier in Renoir's production, as Courbet would remain the primary artist with whom he grappled. The reverberations of Courbet's 1867 pavilion reached a climax in Renoir's nude production in his Bather with a Terrier of 1870, a monumental vertical composition that essentially recasts his first failed attempt at creating a salon-worthy nude in 1865. The painting is a curious amalgamation of Courbet's Bathers of 1853 and Young Ladies on the Banks of the Seine, which depicts two pleasure-seeking women of dubious moral character lounging al fresco, which, as I mentioned, caused a huge scandal when it was exhibited at the Salon of 1857. It may not be obvious why this was so scandalous, but the figure in the foreground is actually laying around in her underwear. She's laying on top of her dress and sort of covered by a beautiful shawl. One more fun detail to point out is that there is a discarded rowboat with a man's hat, and only seeing this in person for the first time do I see that that gets completely transported into Renoir's version. In an attempt to avoid the aspersions cast on Courbet's two scandalous paintings, Renoir invested his large bather with the trappings of purity in spite of the fact that she is most definitely naked, not nude. The demure pose, based on the classical Venus pudica model, conceals the figure's pubic area with a carefully placed hand that simultaneously draws attention to a gold wedding band placed at the dead center of the composition. Can't miss it. Rather than Olympia's cat, Renoir has included a lapdog, the traditional symbol of fidelity in Western art. Renoir's conversion of Courbet's prototypes into a respectable married bourgeois woman gained him entry to the Salon of 1870 with his first nude, although his realist treatment of the woman's mature body didn't spare him from the same negative critique that was launched at Courbet's Bathers 17 years earlier, namely that the figure was ugly and dirty. In spite of this triumph, Renoir remained unsure of what direction he wanted to take and vacillated between the avant-garde model and that of the classical tradition as represented by Ingres. For Courbet and Manet were not the only artists who had major one-man shows in 1867. Our friend Ingres died just before the opening of the World's Fair, prompting a massive retrospective of his works that spring. Among the 600 works that went on display were some of his most famous nudes, including these two that you know are two odalisques, as well as the Valpensum Bather and the Source, which plays upon the traditional Western allegory of woman as nature, woman as vessel, woman as source from which life flows like water. Ingres' retrospective made an impact on even the most antagonistic painters. Courbet not only visited the retrospective and wrote about it, but he was sincerely laudatory about a number of his paintings, and you're seeing him there on the right make his own realist version, sort of a strange crossover between the Valpensum Bather, seen from the back, and the Source, which of course he calls the Source in 1868. Renoir, too, made his own response to Ingres with Nymph by a Stream of 1869-70. His portrayal of a mythological subject, a nymph identified simply by the garland in her hair, is also a traditional allegory for woman as source. The connection to Ingres is mediated by Rococo prototypes and Courbet's frank example of a mature, naturalistic body with touchable, living flesh grows even stronger when we consider Renoir's odalisque from the same time, which is regarded as the nymph's pendant since they share the same format, the same size, and the same inverted composition of a reclining female subject. Renoir didn't stay in the Orientalist mode for long, but it had a lasting impact on his production, for it provided a solution to the significant problem of representing a realistic female nude from the front without having to resort to gestures of modesty or without exposing genitalia, which of course could never be realistic. He seized upon the example provided by Chassériau, whom, as you'll recall, was Ingres' star pupil, and paintings such as the Toilette of Esther, which presents the biblical heroine stripped to her waist, her gown and white undergarment gathered around her hips, while her gold bracelets and cuffs accentuate her state of undress. By 1875, Renoir had incorporated this formula in his painting Before the Bath, in which an everyday Parisian woman fixing her hair in her bedroom, her shift pulled down around her waist to expose her breasts, replaces the exotic Middle Eastern concubine, and you'll also recognize Chasserio's kind of reference to underarm hair. But that same year, 1875, Renoir transported the nude outdoors. And from that point forward, the sensuous depiction of contemporary, everyday French women bathing in lush outdoor settings became his mainstay. In his revolutionary study, the white undergarment clutched around the figure's hips draws attention to the gold bracelet and prominent ring, breaking the illusion of a timeless, classical Arcadia, and firmly planting this respectable married woman in the here and now. The composition once more draws from Courbet's example, such as the bather sleeping near a brook, especially the virtuoso portrayal of sunlight splashing shadows across the nude's chest. Yet the dazzling impressionist aesthetic of rapidly applied and fluid brushstrokes, eye-popping palette, sensitive rendering of plein air effects, and the figure perfectly integrated into its background belongs entirely to Renoir and represents a breakthrough in his treatment of the nude. With study, Renoir finally achieved what he'd been seeking since his days in Glare Studio, a perfect balance between tradition and modernity, between serious painting and avant-garde innovation. And though his impressionist style would evolve in the decades ahead, Renoir maintained this construct for depicting the body as a real, palpable, sensual object within a lush, natural setting until his death. It is a lasting homage to Courbet, and through him Manet and Ingres, as he took up their reins as one of the 19th century's last great painters of the female nude. Thank you.